I'm sitting here bundled up with 3 electric blankets, all turned up to the highest setting. My legs are tucked into a foot spa filled with almost boiling hot water, and it feels like my hair is practically on fire from all the heat. Even with all of that, I'm still trying to stay warm, and it makes me wonder how people managed to survive, or even died, during the brutal winter months of the Middle Ages. How did they keep themselves warm when the cold seemed endless? What kinds of food did they rely on to make it through the season? And how did they pass the time without any of the modern comforts we take for granted today, like double-glazed windows, God of War Ragnarok, or Netflix? The arrival of the Little Ice Age, which lasted from around 1300 to about 1870, brought even colder and more unforgiving winters to the later Middle Ages. Those long dark months became far more dangerous, with hunger and deadly illnesses always waiting around the corner. For medieval people, winter wasn't just uncomfortable, it was one of the most frightening times of the entire year. Most peasant homes had very little insulation, so cold drafts found their way inside from every direction. These houses were usually built from wood, wattle, and daub, and in many parts of Europe they were raised on earthen mounds, which helped hold on to a bit of warmth. The fireplace sat at the center of the home, serving 2 important purposes at once. It provided heat for the family and acted as the place where meals were cooked. Instead of having a large chimney that would let valuable heat escape, many homes simply had ventilation holes in the roof to allow the smoke to drift out. The downside was obvious. Smoke filled the house, soot built up everywhere, and during the long winter months the people living there constantly smelled like smoke. Some homes had a small second floor that could only be reached by climbing a ladder. That upper space was mostly used for storage, while the main room below held the family's tables, beds, and the all-important fire. In some cases, there was also a separate section connected to the house where livestock could be kept. In Scandinavia, Viking longhouses were designed a little differently. They featured long, narrow fire pits that ran through the building. Stones lined these fire pits, soaking up the heat from the flames and slowly releasing it, helping spread warmth throughout the entire house. Viking longhouses also included built-in stalls where cattle stayed during the coldest months of the year. Cows, chickens, and pigs weren't just valuable because they provided food and useful materials. They also helped warm the house with their body heat. Of course, sharing your home with animals came with plenty of disadvantages. The living space was crowded, noisy, and smelled pretty awful. Still, if you were curled up next to a pig with a roaring fire nearby, some Marvin Gaye playing in the background, and a couple of nice bottles of Chateau Cheval Blanc within reach, well, you get the idea. At least you probably weren't freezing. Homes that relied on portable braziers faced another serious danger. A single careless mistake could start a fire, and many houses were destroyed because of accidents involving these heating devices. Stone buildings had their own problem. They were incredibly cold, and glass windows were considered a luxury that only wealthy people could afford. During the winter of the 1230s, the Palace of Westminster in London had its windows glazed so the royal chambers wouldn't be as windy as they had been before. While the new glass didn't make the rooms especially warm, it did stop icy gusts from blowing straight through the building. Farther south, on the French island of Maguelone, workers sealed the cathedral windows with plaster during the winter months to help keep out the cold. Poorer families didn't have that option. Instead, they did the best they could by covering gaps and window openings with paper, branches, or thick foliage to block as much of the freezing draft as possible. When it came to staying warm, people in the Middle Ages relied on 2 simple ideas: staying close to a source of heat and trapping that warmth against their bodies. The easiest way to do that was by wearing several layers of clothing. They usually started with linen undergarments, then added layers of wool and heavier outer garments. Wool did an excellent job of keeping the cold out, but it was thick, heavy, and incredibly itchy. The linen underneath acted as a comfortable barrier between the rough wool and the skin. It also had the added benefit of being much easier to wash and dry than wool, making it the practical choice for the layer closest to the body. During the coldest months of the year, people often kept their outdoor clothing on even after they went inside. Boots, wool gloves, scarves, and heavy cloaks stayed on because the houses were still bitterly cold. Between the constant smoke from the fire, everyone's sweat, and the animals living under the same roof, winter life indoors must have been filled with some pretty unforgettable smells. People with a little more money had access to clever devices for keeping warm. One example was a metal hand warmer, which was especially useful for priests. Long church services in freezing stone buildings could leave their hands numb, and dropping the Blessed Sacrament during communion was considered completely unacceptable. These decorative hand warmers were made from metal and featured a small hinged container with tiny holes punched into it. Hot charcoal was placed inside, allowing gentle heat to escape through the openings. That way, priests could warm their hands without burning themselves. People also came up with another simple but effective trick. Bricks or large stones were heated in the fire, wrapped in cloth, and taken to bed before going to sleep. They worked much like a modern hot water bottle, providing warmth throughout the night. Wealthier families could afford winter clothing lined with luxurious furs, making their garments even better at holding in heat. Peasants, on the other hand, sometimes relied on rabbit pelts or lambskins for extra insulation. They might not have looked nearly as impressive, but they did the job just as well when it came to staying warm. Getting those furs wasn't always as simple as heading into the woods, though. Hunting game often required the permission of the local lord. On top of that, the sumptuary laws of 1363 restricted who could wear certain kinds of fur. According to those rules, only the wives and daughters of landowning peasants and skilled craftspeople were allowed to wear fox, lamb, rabbit, or cat fur. The worst winter weather wasn't limited to northern Europe. In many years, the cold spread across the mainland, bringing brutal conditions to places that weren't normally associated with extreme winters. During the winter of 1363 to 1364, many of Europe's largest rivers and lakes froze solid between December and March. In Mainz, Germany, the Rhine remained frozen for an incredible 70 days. Farther downstream, the people of Cologne took advantage of the thick ice by holding a market right on top of the frozen river. The town of Fosses in present-day Belgium stayed buried under snow for more than 3 months. Even parts of southern Europe experienced unusually severe conditions. In February 1352, the Venetian lagoon, the Atlantic Ocean near Bordeaux in France, and the estuary of the Rhone all froze over. That same year, the region around Florence, Italy, remained covered by a blanket of snow for more than a month. Then, in 1359, one account described the snowfall across central Italy in remarkable detail. The snow rose across central Italy to an extraordinary height. To lighten the roofs, the snow was thrown into the streets, and some of the towns were blocked with inhabitants trapped for several days in their homes. In Bologna, snowdrifts reportedly reached heights of up to 18 feet, while in Modena they were said to be even deeper. The winter of 1389 brought another extraordinary wave of snowfall, this time to the Languedoc region in southern France. A chronicle from the city of Montpellier recorded the devastating consequences. These snowfalls were so great that they destroyed many farmsteads. Many died because their houses fell down on them. Other people died of cold, others of hunger because people had run out of provisions. For people living in Scandinavia, weather like this was far more familiar. Heavy snow and frozen landscapes were part of everyday life, so travel and communication could continue more easily than they could farther south. The Vikings used different kinds of skis for hunting and transportation, allowing them to move across the snow with much greater ease. Elsewhere in Europe, however, peasants usually depended on sturdy boots and horse-drawn sleds during the winter. Even with those, traveling long distances became nearly impossible once severe weather set in. Remote mountain communities, such as those in the Lozère region, were especially vulnerable. When the harshest winters arrived, some of these isolated settlements simply couldn't survive. Food preparation was one of the biggest challenges of medieval life, especially in farming communities where the work never really stopped. No matter the season, there was always another job waiting to be done. Surviving the winter took months of planning, and people had to begin preparing long before the cold weather arrived. One of the most important tasks was gathering firewood. In many places, people started collecting it as early as spring and continued throughout the summer. The wood was cut, bundled, and carefully stored so there would be enough fuel to keep the fire burning through the long winter months. When the autumn harvest came in, nearly everything had to be preserved if it was going to last until spring. People relied on methods like pickling, smoking, drying, and brining to keep meat and other foods from spoiling. These techniques helped stretch their food supplies for as long as possible. Grains, cereals, and pulses were dried thoroughly before being stored in clay or ceramic containers. Throughout the winter, they could be added to hearty soups and stews or ground into flour for making bread and hard biscuits. Fresh fruit and berries were much harder to come by once winter arrived, so they also had to be preserved during the warmer months. Air drying and pickling were common ways to make sure these foods remained available long after the harvest season had ended. During the summer, goats, cows, and chickens supplied fresh milk and eggs, both of which were essential parts of the medieval diet. Milk could be turned into butter, cheese, or yogurt, allowing it to last much longer than it would in its fresh form. In Scandinavia, people ate large amounts of a sour milk cheese known as skyr. After milk was curdled and strained to make cheese, the leftover liquid, called whey, didn't go to waste. It was excellent for pickling food. A large barrel holding around 30 liters or about 53 pints of whey could easily preserve an entire side of beef. Salted, smoked, and dried meats such as lamb, beef, ham, and fish could remain edible for an impressively long time, making them reliable food sources throughout the winter. Water was usually easy to obtain because most people lived near a well, stream, or river. But if severe weather left families trapped inside their homes, they had another option. They could simply melt snow and use it as their water supply until conditions improved. The Great Famine. All the planning in the world didn't matter if the fields produced little or nothing. No one could harvest crops that had never grown in the first place. Famines were an unfortunate part of life in medieval Europe, and historians believe they happened, on average, about once every 20 years. The most devastating of them all was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. It began when relentless rains arrived in the spring of 1315, soaking the fields and ruining the crops. That was only the start of a much larger disaster. As the rain seemed to go on without end, harvests shrank dramatically. In some areas, crop yields dropped by as much as 1/3. Livestock also suffered, with many animals dying from starvation and disease, making an already desperate situation even worse. The famine pushed many people to the breaking point. Widespread hunger led to a sharp rise in crime, and historical accounts describe horrifying acts, including infanticide and even cannibalism, as people struggled to survive. The effects of the disaster lasted for years. Europe didn't fully recover until around 1322, long after the rains had finally stopped. Altogether, the famine affected as many as 30 million people and is believed to have claimed between 1.5 and 3 million lives. Although the Black Death would kill even more people later in the 14th century, the Great Famine remains the worst natural disaster of the late Middle Ages and one of the darkest chapters in medieval European history. Once all the repairs were finished and the daily chores were out of the way, people still had to find something to do to keep from going stir-crazy. There wasn't much farm work that could be done during the winter, so families spent a great deal of their time indoors. That didn't mean everyone stayed inside all the time, though. Medieval people also enjoyed winter activities like sledding and ice skating on frozen rivers and lakes. Early skates were often made from horse shin bones or carefully polished pieces of wood, while later versions were crafted from iron. In Viking communities, snowball fights weren't just for fun. They were believed to help prepare children for future combat by improving their aim, coordination, and toughness. A beautifully illustrated Book of Hours created around 1460 for the Duchess of Burgundy even includes a scene showing both children and adults taking part in a lively snowball fight. Similar images also appear in other medieval manuscripts and frescoes. When people stayed indoors, they kept busy by spinning wool, telling stories, and playing games. Strategy games such as chess and backgammon were popular throughout medieval Europe, while dice games were another favorite way to pass the long evenings. The Vikings also enjoyed board games that tested planning and tactical skill. Winter was also an important season for hunting. Boar hunts, in particular, combined sport with the practical need to gather food for the table. One of the most widely read books of the High Middle Ages was the Secretum Secretorum. This fascinating work covered everything from ethics and astrology to medicine and justice. According to the book, the dominant bodily humor during winter was phlegm, and it claimed that people could reduce its harmful effects by adjusting their diet. The text recommended eating warming foods such as pigeon, game birds, and mutton, while also enjoying fine red wine in moderation. At the same time, it advised people to avoid bloodletting, laxatives, and excessive sexual activity, along with any other kind of overindulgence. Interestingly, it also suggested that if someone was going to eat more than usual, winter was the best season to do it because the body's natural heat was believed to move inward, improving digestion. That's probably comforting advice when Christmas comes around. For people living in southern Europe, where hot summers and mild weather were the norm, a severe medieval winter could be an overwhelming experience. Those in the north, however, were far more accustomed to freezing temperatures. With warm furs, skis, and generations of experience, they were generally better prepared to deal with snow and ice. Even so, winter remained a dangerous season for everyone. Food supplies gradually ran low as the months dragged on, and crowded living conditions made it much easier for diseases to spread. Careful planning and well-stocked supplies could help families stay warm and fed, but during the darkest days of winter, survival was never guaranteed. For people living in the Middle Ages, death was never very far away. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Ancient Echoes. I hope you're staying warm this winter, and I'll see you next Friday for another episode. Take care, and cheers.